Coming up in the Atlantic Division preview series, the Toronto Maple Leafs. What did their offseason look like? How big a gap is there between Buffalo and Toronto? We'll get to the Leafs coming up here in the Locked On Sabres podcast.
Your Locked On Sabres, your daily podcast on the Buffalo Sabres. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And thanks for making Locked On Sabres your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Be sure to check us out on our YouTube channel and also on our text line, which you can sign up for if you're not already a texter at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnSabres. Sneaky Joe DiBiase today on today's show. This episode of Locked On Sabres, brought to you by FanDuel, now through September 22nd. So almost exactly a month. All FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Locked On Sabres. All right, I'm excited. Let's talk some hockey. We are just about a month away from the preseason, as we'll get rolling here pretty soon. And we've got some couple more teams in the division to talk about, actually everybody but Florida, that we haven't talked about so far. If you missed our last show on the Sabres prospects with Hadi Kalakash, check that out on this feed, wherever you may be listening, or on our YouTube channel. You can check us out there as well. Today, we're going to talk a lot, though, about the Toronto Maple Leafs and what we're looking at for big headline stories about Toronto this year, and why I think you could call it a last dance, if you will, Toronto's last gasp with this core to get over the hump. We'll see. And there's one big name, really, that's about. And we'll get to that, John Tavares, coming up on today's show. Some of the headlines about Toronto, how their roster is currently set up. And this has been a team that's been thin in the past. I think they might be as thin as they ever have been before. All that coming up. Share some memories, too. I'd love to hear from the texters or the listeners on our Twitter account. What is your favorite Sabres Leafs memory? Because I think there's a lot of different cool places and avenues that you could go down. For me, there's a lot of good ones, right? Because the Sabres have had a lot of success against the Maple Leafs, really, even when they haven't been a very good hockey team. So we'll dive right in on this. But the Sabres historically have been great against Toronto. And again, there's almost no years where they're not great against Toronto. In fact, in the 51 seasons that the Buffalo Sabres have played against the Toronto Maple Leafs, the 51 seasons, they have had a losing record against Toronto in 10 of those seasons. So encapsulated in that one season, what was their record? What was their record in each season against Toronto? You go down the list, you're going to find only 10 seasons in which they had a losing record to the Toronto Maple Leafs. That is incredible. Incredible success. The Sabres all time against the Toronto Maple Leafs have played 229 games. They are 112, 88, and 18. 112, 88, and 18. That is a points percentage that is sixth best than against any opponent. So 5 teams, a better way to say it, is there are 5 teams that the Sabres have played in their history that they have a better record against by points percentage, by wins percentage, than Toronto. And those 5 teams, a nice little trivia question. If you're looking to talk some hockey with your buddies and you want to try to get them to get guessing on something. Who are the 5 teams that the Sabres have a better record against than Toronto? The Los Angeles Kings, the Washington Capitals, the Arizona Coyotes, who are now the Utah hockey team, the San Jose Sharks, and also this one you'd never get. Congratulations if you did, but the Cleveland Barons. The Sabres have the best record against the Cleveland Barons. They were 25, 13, and 8 when they played Cleveland back in the 70s. So they've done great against Toronto. They've done incredible against the Toronto Maple Leafs. If you look at kind of their more recent trajectory success last year, you had one of the best games of the entire season. After the Sabres get bombarded by the Columbus Blue Jackets, which led to the Fire Don Granato chant. I was in the crowd that day. They gave up 9 goals to the worst team in the Eastern Conference. Well, the next game after that, last season, remember, this is not a very good Sabres team at all, but they then returned home to beat the socks off the Toronto Maple Leafs by a 9-3 final. It was 9-4 that they lost to Columbus. They came back that Thursday night and they beat Toronto 9-3. So that could be your best memory. I mean, having all those Toronto fans in the crowd and having them lose like that is always fun. I remember one of my memories is during the tank season, where, of course, the Sabres are the worst team in hockey. They're one of the worst teams of all time. And Toronto in those years, you know, they were okay, right? That was the Phil Kessel, Dion Phaneuf teams, bubble playoff team at best. And I remember being at one of those tank games in the winter, maybe like January. And the Sabres are bad, horrible. And they're just beating Toronto. They're beating them bad. I looked back at that schedule to try to figure out what exact game it was. And I think I got it. It's gotta be the 6-2 home Sabres win against the Toronto Maple Leafs. Going into that game in November 15th of 2015 is one of my best Sabre Leaf memories. They are 3-13-2. That's their record going into that game. 3-13-2. And Toronto comes into town and the Sabres beat them 6-2. The Sabres had lost 6 games in a row leading up to that night. 5 games in a row, excuse me. And Toronto gets beat. And I'm in the crowd, and Leaf fans are throwing jerseys on the ice. There was a jersey thrown on the ice, actually, last year during the 9-goal game. And some Leaf fan in the 300 level opens up a brand new beer, and he chucks this thing from 5 rows up. Like 5 rows from the nose, the very last row. So this thing, I mean, how far is that? How far are you throwing something to go from the 5th to last row in the arena to get on the ice? I mean, this guy must have been at a Josh Allen arm, because I'm telling you, I'll never forget this. This full beer is soaring across the sky like a comet as the beer tail is coming out of it as it's moving. And I mean, it was, the guy's an idiot, and it was really dangerous, right? Because that thing had some momentum, and it landed, I believe, like 3 feet from Dion Phaneuf at center ice. If that's hit Dion Phaneuf, I mean, that would have injured Dion Phaneuf, that thing. But I'll never forget that throw. It's one of the greatest throws I've ever seen in my life by a Leaf fan. Other great memories, of course, 2007, there was a regular season game where the Sabres are down 4-1 in the 3rd period, and they roar back. Vanek with a big slap shot goal. Briere scored. Pominville. Stafford got the winner. And it's one of the great memories for me for the Sabres and Leafs. I'm too young to remember the 99 conference finals, but I have seen those videos. Bob Cole or Rick Jenneret, whoever's got the call. Especially there's a game in that series, maybe it's game 4, where the Sabres score 3 goals in 1 minute, including a Rob Ray goal. And there's Lindy laughing on the bench when Ray scores. And everyone's having a great time. They're beating the snot out of Toronto, and they're on their way to the Stanley Cup final. Yeah, great memories. Only good memories usually when the Sabres play the Leafs. The Heritage Classic a couple years ago where Dylan Cousins runs Austin Matthews because Matthews tried to take Dahlin's head off. That's when this team was a lot more likable. Outdoor game in Hamilton. So let me know if I know I stole a lot of them there. But if you got a favorite Sabre Leaf memory, I would love for you to share them. And you can do that by going to our text line. If you're not already a subscriber, join subtext.com/LockedOnSabres. This year, sadly, that's why I hate the current schedule. I hate the current schedule format. It's the worst. When I was growing up, you know, I'm talking like just pre-lockout, but also post-lockout. The Sabres played the Leafs 8 times a year. 8 times a year. 4 home games, 4 road games. It was great. A 10th of your season against, I would say, the team I like to watch them play the most. Such a shame now that we only get 3 matchups all year against the Maple Leafs. And when it comes to home games, you only have 1 in the first 80 games of the season. One Toronto home game in the first 80 home games of the season is a absolute shame. It's pathetic, and I hate the way the NHL does the schedule. Your matchups this year with Toronto: Sunday, December 15th, a Sunday game at 5 in Toronto. Then they come back the next Friday, so 2 Toronto matchups within a week. Friday, December 10th, the Sabres get to host Toronto. So a Friday night game against the Leafs. That'll be exciting. And then the second to last game of the year. And what are the odds they're in it? You hope, but, we know this team the last 10 years. I can't count on them being in it in the second to last game of the year. So that sucks too, because I hope that game's not meaningless. On the other hand, even though I don't know how confident I am that game will be meaningful, if that game is meaningful, we'll think optimistically here on today's show. If Tuesday, April 15th, hosting Toronto, game 81, is for the playoffs or hell, for seeding in the division, I'm not going to be that optimistic here. Let's say for the playoffs. The Sabres are still in it, and Toronto's coming to town at home. That's going to be a juicy game, a really juicy game. When we come back, the Leafs offseason, why I think they're thinner than ever, and why I think this could be the last dance for at least this version of the Toronto Maple Leafs. That's coming up here on the Locked On Sabres podcast. We are presented here on the show by Indeed. Indeed.com/hire. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. Leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences, so the more you use Indeed, the better it is. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now. Support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Back here on the Locked On Sabres podcast, it's the Maple Leaf edition of the Locked On Sabres podcast as we're running through the Atlantic Division team by team. If you missed our first show, comparing, contrasting the Sabres to the Panthers, their blueprint a little bit, what their offseason was like, the kingpins of the division, Florida's the favorite, and the defending Stanley Cup champion. You can find that in our feed or on our YouTube channel. Thanks for making us your first listen, of course, every day, especially here during the summer when, it's not a lot of news. But, of course, be sure to make sure that your second listen, Locked On Bills. Joe Marino does a great job as we lead into the Bills season. All the injuries that are going on right now, especially at wide receiver. Some good news, though, on the safety front. Joe's covering it all. Recapping, check out his all-22 recap of last Saturday's preseason game against Pittsburgh, and he'll have a preview coming up on the Panthers game coming up on Saturday, Carolina Panthers game at Highmark Stadium, 1 o'clock on Saturday. Locked On Bills, check it out. So let's get to Toronto and what was their offseason. Well, they got thinner. But I do have to say, they didn't really lose anything catastrophic. The big blow up, I guess we're just never going to get it. Ever going to get it. I'm naive, right? Like every year I kind of fall for it of, here we go. They lost again. They disappointed everybody again. This is when they do it. And we're into like the 8th season of this core of the Toronto Maple Leafs. They have won 1 playoff round, and they've only had 2 coaches, and one of them was fired, or this is their 3rd coach now that they're on. They've only had 2 coaches, though, before this, and Mike Babcock was, kind of fired, we think, more because of things that were happening in the locker room and all the stories there about how he mistreated players more than maybe his results. But Sheldon Keefe out the door. He's now in New Jersey. And by the way, he is the favorite to win Coach of the Year, Keefe in New Jersey. Craig Berube is now the head coach of the Toronto Maple Leafs. That's their big move of the offseason, was the coach change. And going for a proven veteran coach who has won a Stanley Cup and has won a Stanley Cup fairly recently, right? 6 years ago with the St. Louis Blues. Berube, tough nose, hockey, different from what Sheldon Keefe, I guess, had more of a reputation of. So I don't hate the hire. Berube would have been a fine idea to me if the Sabres had gone that direction. Who's to say they didn't? I think there was some reporting that maybe the Sabres were interested, but Berube ends up going to Toronto. So fine with the coach hire. I don't really have any strong opinions one way or another on him. He's a hockey coach. He's not a terrible hockey coach. He doesn't do anything that wows me. He's just a guy. My problem has actually always been more with the Leafs general manager than it has been now with their coaching decisions, because Brad Treleving has just never impressed me. Not when he was in Calgary and not in his recent time here in Toronto. Again, though, there's no big loss. There's no big trade. All the talk of, they're going to move on from Mitch Marner. They're going to move on from Mitch Marner. And here we go. We're sitting here on August 21st, and there's not a peep about them moving Mitch Marner, and it feels like that's just not going to happen. However, it does need to be pointed out that this is the final year of his contract. So while there might not be a peep about Marner right now, if he doesn't sign an extension in the next month, and even 2 months as we get closer to the regular season, the noise dial on that is going to get turned up to 11 if he has not signed an extension. And maybe what we've been waiting for is training camp, right? Training camp next month, when the preseason gets rolling and as players arrive back at their team facilities. If Marner arrives back in Toronto for Leafs training camp, going into the final year of his contract, that's going to be all anybody is talking about. Maybe not just in Toronto, but league-wide, is what's going on with Marner. Is he going to sign? Will they trade him instead of losing him for nothing? And maybe that's, I have not thought about Marner in months. Not for the Sabres even, in like a dream scenario. Maybe that's worth doing, especially in the middle of the summer here where there's not a lot happening. Maybe I'll dedicate one of our shows in the next couple of weeks to is this still doable? The Sabres have not used their cap space. And I've pointed out before that while there are a lot of players that you just have to kind of bet on never wanting to come to Buffalo, I'm not willing to say that about Marner. Marner, there are things about his background that make me think that guy might be open to coming to Buffalo. And I'm not that way about almost any player. But Marner, I have the curiosity of, would he come to Buffalo? So Marner is a big talking point going into the season, but there's not really anything on him right now. But they haven't done that. Other moves, like their big splash move of the offseason was adding a couple of veteran defensemen. And really, Chris Tanev is, to me, the better move. They add Chris Tanev and Oliver Ekman-Larsson. Both players signed 4-year contracts. Those are big commitments, by the way, to Tanev, who's 34, and Oliver Ekman-Larsson, who's 33. Those are big commitments, long-term commitments for that age. Tanev, $4.5 million. Ekman-Larsson, $3.5 million. I like the Tanev one more, even though he's a year older and a million more expensive. Tanev is a good defenseman. The Sabres had reportedly been interested in him in the past. He's a solid defensive defenseman. He gives you a little bit offensively, but not much. He's much more, thinking right shot, first pair guy, partnered with Morgan Rielly, allow Rielly to kind of be the offensive quarterback that he is, and Tanev can kind of be the more stay-at-home guy, physical defenseman. His analytic numbers are good. I like Tanev a lot. I don't love the age, but I like the player. So that's the punishment, or that's the consequence, right? You wanted Chris Tanev if you're the Leafs, and okay, you got him, and for the next 2 years, I like that. But once you start getting to age 37 and 38 in that contract, I'm probably not going to like it as much. You never know what a player like that can age, but I mean, it's very high potential of it not going well in the final 2 years. So to me, it's more of a, hey, 2 years, we get this guy at a high level, and let's just hope he's not that bad in the final 2 years, or maybe we'll have to try to find a way out of it. So I like the Tanev move. Ekman-Larsson, fine. I didn't think Ekman-Larsson would get a 4-year contract. He was fine in Florida, but I didn't think he was great. So their blue line now as a whole, though, weird that we're starting with the blue line, I know, but it's an old blue line. It's not bad. They've had worse. I think they've had worse in their past, and they've had some bad blue lines in this Austin Matthews era. But Morgan Riley and Chris Tanev, Ekman Larson and Timothy Liljegren, Jake McCabe, who's played some big minutes for them, and Simone Bennett, also Connor Timmins. Like, that's not a bad blue line. It's not great, but it's not a bad blue line. And maybe the one thing I should say about Ekman Larson, even if he's not my favorite player, they had Jake McCabe quarterbacking the second power play unit last year. That's how thin on offensive defensemen they were, and Ekman Larson should satisfy that need. How could I bury the lead, by the way? I don't really care about captaincy, which is kind of why I didn't mention it, I guess. But their other big move of the offseason is transitioning the captaincy from John Tavares to Austin Matthews. And even Tavares said he knew this was coming. This is Matthews' team, and Matthews should be the captain. He's the face of the franchise. It is a little significant, though, or maybe it's more symbolic, that this is looking like the end of an era in Toronto. And we'll get to that when we come back, because Marner is not the only big name in Toronto that is going into the final year of his contract. So we'll ask the question when we come back. How big a gap really is there between the Sabres and the Leafs right now? And can I see the gap closing in the next year or two? We'll get to that when we return here on the Locked On Sabres podcast. I'll also give you what their over-under is and how different that is from the Sabres, who are at 88.5 points for the season. That's coming up here on the Locked On Sabres podcast. We are presented here on the show by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive. ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Final segment here in the Locked On Sabres podcast as we roll through the Atlantic Division. Today we are spending some time on Toronto. Matthews, now the captain, or at least they're making that transition. Tavares was the captain by himself. Now Matthews will be donning the C. Tavares, 33 years old, in the final year of his contract at $11 million. It is pretty incredible that guy left the New York Islanders and got maybe more on Long Island than other places. Got hammered for it in some respect. I didn't hammer him for it. I know there were a lot of people that didn't. Just, maybe more on Long Island. Again, that was happening. But anyways, he goes to Toronto to fulfill his boyhood dream of playing for the Leafs. And also would have thought he was joining an NHL equivalent of a super team, right? Like, the Leafs were already great, and they already had all the forward and scoring they needed, but then they signed the number one free agent, John Tavares, elite number one center in the league. Wow, can you believe it? And he's going into the final year of that contract, and the dude's won one playoff series. Tavares has won fewer playoff series than the Islanders. The Islanders left and have won more. Way more, in fact. I think they've won 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think it's 5 playoff series since Tavares left. That's incredible. So that has not gone well for him. Maybe he sticks around, by the way, after this year on like 1-year contracts or cheap contracts. I don't know. But this could be the end. This could be the end of Tavares, and it certainly is the end of them giving him a lot of money. What are they going to get out of John Tavares at this advanced age for him? He's still a fine player, but he's not the elite number one center that he once was. 65 points last year, 29 goals scored. He's still good, but his ice time you've seen go down from, at one point early in his Toronto career, he was averaging 19:33 a night. Now that is under 18 minutes. His average ice time's gone down almost 2 full minutes. And that's natural, right? Matthews is the number one center. He should be the number one center. And he's the guy that kind of, has taken more and more of the ice time as they've gone. In the playoffs this past year, Tavares really didn't show up. 7-game series, he had 1 goal and 1 assist. That can't happen. Otherwise, like the year before, he was fine. 8 points in 11 playoff games. He had 6 points in 7 playoff games before that. Like he hasn't always been their problem. But last playoffs, he was not producing anything for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Dealing with some bang-up injuries, that happens. Kind of maybe the last dance, though. I don't know. Is it the last dance? They've got 2 of their best players going into contract years. Is John Tavares and Mitch Marner going to re-sign? Because if the answer is no, then that's a bit of a teardown for having a guy like Austin Matthews and Willie Nylander in the fold long term. I mean, it's more of a retool. Would they do that, though? I mean, I don't know what they do about Tavares. Maybe they trade him at the deadline, or they just let him ride it out. Marner's the one I don't think they would let loose for nothing. If they think Marner's not going, is not staying, then I think they trade him. Tavares, if they find out that he might be leaving, I think they just let it ride, because I don't think you're getting much for him at an $11 million salary at this point in time. So, bit of a last dance. The gap right now between the Sabres and the Leafs is stark. It's big. 14 points in the over-under point totals. The Leafs over-under is 102.5 at FanDuel Sportsbook. The Sabres is 88.5. There is a gap right now. But as we evaluate team by team in the division, hey, eventually, if the Sabres are ever going to get good, they got to leapfrog somebody in that top 4. And last year, I talked a lot about it being Boston or Tampa, because those 2 teams were getting older and Boston didn't have any centers. And Tampa showed some signs of age, but it didn't happen. It didn't really happen at all that those 2 teams fell back. And especially the Sabres didn't take advantage anyway, but neither team fell back to make it easy. Toronto, I don't think that would happen this year, but, again, if Marner goes and Tavares goes, you got to consider them a possible team that the Sabres could one day in the next 2 years leapfrog. But a lot needs to happen in between. For now, that's the second leading favorite to win the division behind Florida. Plus 300 to win the Atlantic Division is Toronto. And the Sabres are way further back than that. Of those top 4, though, Toronto, to me, I might put them 4th. I might put them behind Tampa and behind Boston. One thing that we have not touched on in this episode yet, and I'll wrap with it here on Toronto, is how thin they are and what they are in goal. Right now, you look at their projected lineup, and Bobby McCann, a guy who has 15 career goals at age 28, is a second liner. That's how thin they are. Matthew Nyes is a first liner. He's not as bad a player, but first liner, Max Domi, Cal Yarncroc, Pontus Holmberg. Holmberg is like an AHL guy for most of his career. That's their third line. And then they're just kind of at the Marlies are filling out their bottom 6. And even maybe one of their spots in the top 6. So I like their blue line decent enough, but forward depth is minimal. And then in goal, all right, Joseph Wall, they signed him. 3-year extension, $3.6 million per year. But man, I would be hesitant to just assume that he's a number 1 goalie in the NHL because he's played 36 games. 3-year deal for $3.6 million for a guy that's played 36 games. And last year, in his most ice time, most games played, 23 starts. That's it, by the way, 23 starts. He had a .907 save percentage. I don't know what they were thinking with that contract. 25 years old, and he was a 3rd-round pick once upon a time. Like, he was a good prospect, but I just can't believe what they gave him, and I can't believe they're entrusting their net right now to Wall. And Anthony Stolarz right now is the backup. Just the goaltending is really, really flimsy for me in Toronto. And that's a big reason why I picked Tampa or Boston. I think Toronto's got the younger superstar in Matthews, but Tampa's got Vasilevsky, who's one of the best in the world. Boston's got Jeremy Swayman, who's one of the best in the world. And the Leafs have a guy that's played 36 games that I don't trust at all. Goaltending is a huge difference between the Leafs and then the other 3 teams, the other big of the 3 of the big 4 in the Atlantic. So right now, I think I picked them to finish 4th. I think they'll still make the playoffs. They still think there's a comfortable gap between them and the other teams in the Atlantic, but definitely have to wonder about them for the future with Mitch Marner, with John Tavares, and you have to wonder about their goaltending situation. All right. Let me know. Leafs Sabre memories. I love to go down memory lane here with Toronto. We'll read some of those coming up on our next show, where we will talk about who's next in the odds. We're going by the odds here. Tampa's next, plus 470 to win the Atlantic. We'll talk about the Lightning. Is this finally the year that they get old? We'll get to it. Thanks for listening to today's show and making us your first listen every day. We are 1 month away from preseason hockey. We'll have games to talk about in a month. So can't wait. Talk to you next time here on the Locked On Sabres podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.